Hello, everyone. For this week, we are headed all the way back to the beginning of the Bible. We're actually headed to Genesis. Now, as someone who grew up in the church, I thought for a very long time that I knew everything about Genesis through and through. Because I'd heard all of the stories in Genesis hundreds of times in kids programs and in Sunday school and all of those things. With events like the creation of the world, Noah's Ark, and Joseph's dreams, it's hard to think that there could be more to Genesis. But today, we're going to look at a part of Genesis where there is the most beautiful promise of hope and a future. And we're going to do that by looking at part of Abraham's story. Abraham is probably one of the most recognized names of the Bible, and he lived an incredibly long life. In fact, we don't even really get introduced to him in the Bible until he is 75 years old. And we hear that a few chapters before this. It's pretty crazy that in Abraham's story, it's not even starting to be told until he's 75 years old. When we are introduced to him, we read about some pretty wild adventures that he has had to endure with his family. His wife, Sarai, and him had been moving around in the area. They were encountering royalty and all of these things, all while trying to conceive a child. And if you haven't read the story of Abraham, I really encourage you to do so. There's some pretty amazing things. So Abraham and his wife, Sarai, had for many years, they've been trying to conceive a child. They were desperate to have a child, so much so that in the chapter previous to the one that we're looking at today, Sarai told Abraham to go sleep with her servant Hagar because they thought that that was going to be the only way that they were going to have a child. And while Abraham's son Ishmael was born as a result of this event, it still wasn't what God had intended. That wasn't his plan. So then we come to our passage that we're in today, and we meet Abraham at 99 years old now. That's crazy. He's 99, and God is showing up to him, and he tells him this: I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then I will make my covenant between me and you, and will greatly increase your numbers. How incredible is that Abraham has such an obvious encounter with the Lord. And often, I wish that my encounters with God were this obvious. God appears to Abraham and immediately makes himself known to him. Not only that, God establishes authority over Abraham by saying that he is God Almighty. Sometimes when we have tried to take matters into our own hands and we're trying to just grab onto control over our situations, it's important to have that reminder that in our life, we serve God Almighty, and he has control and authority over us, and he has a plan for us. Then God gives Abraham instructions. He says, walk before me faithfully and be blameless. He's asking Abraham to put all of his faith in him. Then he makes Abraham a covenant with him, and he says that Abraham's honoring of this covenant will bring an increase in his numbers, meaning that God's actually going to honor him and his wife's desires and dreams of having a child. God then continues with the covenant by saying this. He says, as for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham. For I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you, for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. The whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give you as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you. And I will be their God. What an amazing, beautiful promise for Abraham. God is not only stating that Abraham and Sarai are going to get their desire of having a child, but he's actually going to go above and beyond, and he's going to be making him the father of many nations. Kings are going to come from Abram. Generation after generation from Abram are going to know who the Lord is, and God is going to be their God. And just as a side note, as he's saying all of this, God is also adding that he is changing his name from Abram to Abraham to mark this change and this covenant that is going on. Okay, so there's so much to uncover in this promise. And I really want you to take some time to just reflect on what is going on in this chapter with yourself and with others. But I am going to point out a few things. The first thing that I really want to hit home is that Abram was 99 years old when God made this covenant with him. 99. So often we get caught up in our own timing. We place our own expectations of time on God, and God is just so much larger than that. I know that people don't live as long as Abram did at this time, but we can apply this to us today. God is never done with you. It doesn't matter if you're 13, 45, 72, 99. He's just not finished with you yet. God always has a plan. And if you're waiting for something right now, it's important to take note that what God is asking Abram to do is not to run around and complete a bunch of tasks in order for this to get done. He's actually just asking Abram to be faithful and wait for him. The second thing I want to point out is that God can take our dreams and shock us with them. I wonder if God actually gets a chuckle out of sometimes the dreams that we tell him. And not because what we say is bad. It's actually really important to talk to God about the desires and the dreams that we have. But I wonder if sometimes he listens to us and thinks, you just haven't seen anything yet. Abram and Sarai were asking God for a child. And God made them parents of a whole nation. He says this not just to Abraham in our passage, but by verse 15, he also tells Sarai this and tells her that she's going to be the mother of a nation. We never know what God is going to do or how he is going to work in us. The third thing is that God marks this covenant. He doesn't just give the covenant and leave, but he also wants to celebrate the occasion by changing Abram's name to Abraham and Sarai's name to Sarah. Why do I want to point this out? Why do I think it's important? Because I think it's important to take time to remember God's faithfulness to us. While this might not be in the form of a whole name change, maybe that is something you're going to do. It's important for us to make a point to remember the faithfulness of God, and that it's so important. It allows us to have something to look back on when we start to forget about God's faithfulness. So write down what God has done. Maybe even find a way to celebrate what God has done. Then in those times that you start to forget, it's hard to remember, you can go back and actually look at it. Abraham and Sarah, every time they heard their name, they were able to remember that God had made that covenant with them and that God was faithful to them. So after reading this passage, I want you to take time to reflect on these three things. The first is there something that you are waiting on God for? Have you been asking him some big questions and maybe you're waiting on the answer? Let Abraham's story encourage you as you reflect on those things. The second is, what are you dreaming about? And how can you release those dreams to God and let him surprise you with what he has in store for you? Maybe that means releasing some control over some of your dreams, but allowing God to use you in incredible ways. And finally, how will you remember the times where God has shown up? Take time to write down when God has been faithful to you and thank him for those times. Use that list as a way to keep encouraging you. I hope you can see how Abraham's story is one of hope for us, one of hope for our futures. Take time to read through the rest of his story about how God was so faithful with him and use it as encouragement for you about how he can be faithful. God can be faithful with you. Have a great week.